There is a moment, just before sleep, when the mind softens enough to let old questions return. Questions that never truly vanished, only waited. And in that quiet borderland, when thoughts slip loose from the day, one wonders why a place at the edge of the world feels older than the world itself. A continent no one had supposedly seen, yet one that appears on maps long before its discovery. A shape drawn in ink centuries before any ship sliced its frozen waters. And so, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you really like what I'm doing here. And if you don't mind, whisper your location and the time where you are, so this story knows where you're listening from. It begins with an absence, a hollow space in the official record where something should be. Antarctica, they say, was first sighted in 1820. A year that feels almost modern, almost close enough to touch. And yet, why does the coastline of this supposedly unknown land appear on maps from 1513 and 1531 with unnerving confidence? The Piri Reis map, stitched together from older sources, shows a southern landmass strangely free of ice, its contours aligned with what modern satellite surveys would reveal centuries later. The Orontes Phineas map goes even further. Its mountains, rivers, and bays echo in haunting symmetry with the real subglacial geography catalogued through radar in the late 20th century. But if no one had ever been there, and if the continent had been under miles of ice for millions of years, then where did those shapes come from? Scholars debate this, but the debates themselves are thin, fragile, stretched like fabric pulled too tight over something beneath. Some say it is coincidence. Some say cartographers guessed. Others suggest the maps were distorted echoes of different continents. And yet, the accuracy persists. It is the persistence that whispers, the precision that unsettles. How could someone, centuries before ice-penetrating radar, outline a shoreline today buried under 2 miles of ice? To ask that question is not to claim an answer. It is only to acknowledge the dissonance, an old bruise pressed lightly in the dark. The official history of Antarctica rests upon a narrow beam of certainty, and yet, the deeper one looks, the more the beam begins to tremble. The explorers who finally sailed south did not describe a land untouched. They described something more unsettling, a silence that felt inhabited. Roald Amundsen wrote of a sensation of entering an older world, though he did not explain what made it older. Captain James Cook, who circled the Southern Ocean in the 1770s, insisted that any land to the south must be not worth discovering. A strange conclusion for a man who saw nothing, touched nothing, landed nowhere. Why declare worthlessness so quickly unless the real value of the land was already known, already withheld? Yet history loves a clean beginning, a discoverer, a year to put in a textbook. It does not tolerate the uneasy possibility that something was known and then forgotten, or perhaps known and then deliberately erased. But Antarctica refuses to fit neatly. Its story spills out in fragments, ice cores revealing abrupt climate shifts, radar uncovering hidden mountain ranges, ancient maps portraying what should be impossible. It behaves like a memory the world tried to bury but could not fully suppress. And then there is the ice itself, a library written in layers, each snowfall pressing into the next, each year locked inside another. Scientists have drilled deep into these icy archives and found atmospheric records older than human civilization. Yet even these layers contain contradictions. Sudden jumps in temperature, strange fluctuations in greenhouse gases, unexplained chemical traces that mark events never fully understood. It is almost as though the Earth has forgotten parts of its own past, or remembered them imperfectly, as dreams blurred upon waking. When the first ice core results emerged in the 1960s, some researchers noted anomalies, signals that did not align with the slow, steady timeline taught in geology. They were brief and sharp, like interruptions, episodes that suggested the planet did not always move calmly through time, but sometimes lurched, staggered, reset. What would such resets do to memory? To civilizations? To coastlines? To any evidence left behind on a land now buried under ice? Modern reconstructions of Antarctica's past suggest it was not always the white desert we know. There were times when forests clung to its slopes, when rivers wound through its valleys, when the continent lived under a gentler sky. But these eras are pushed far back, tens of millions of years, into epochs safely sealed away from human history. Yet the maps persist, the outlines persist, and so the mind drifts again to quiet, uncomfortable questions. Is it the dates that are wrong, or the assumptions, or simply our notion of what constitutes evidence? Some archaeologists point to global sea level changes at the end of the last ice age, changes so dramatic they submerged entire coastlines. If ancient maritime peoples had mapped the world along those lost shores, only to see them drowned and eventually forgotten, could fragments of their knowledge have survived in traditions, charts, or artifacts long before official histories were written? Some compare the mystery to the way stars shift over thousands of years, memory outlasting presence, knowledge lingering even after its origin is erased. And still, the thought returns, how could anyone map a land that had been frozen for so long? How could anyone see beneath the ice? Perhaps they didn't. Perhaps they mapped what was visible then but is invisible now. Or perhaps Antarctica's ice is not as ancient as assumed. Geologists have studied rapid glaciation events, moments when ice advanced with astonishing speed. Enough speed to bury shorelines before memory could adapt. Enough speed to conceal a world. There are also the stories from the early explorers. Odd, fragmented, rarely discussed. Accounts of mirages that seem too structured, too architectural. Descriptions of shapes appearing through the fog, then vanishing. These were dismissed as illusions, tricks of light, the mind straining in extreme cold. But illusions do not usually follow the shapes of real subglacial features, later confirmed by modern instruments. Illusions do not repeat themselves across centuries. And then there is the silence. Not the silence of nature, but the silence of omission. The blank chapter in world history where a continent should be, yet isn't. A landmass the size of the United States and Mexico combined, treated as though it simply did not exist until the 19th century. How can something so large remain so absent? What kind of story needs a continent erased from its beginning? In the drifting quiet of the night, the mind circles back to the same unresolved tension, the eerie accuracy of the old maps, the impossibility of their details, the way they resemble memories of a world before the ice. It is not proof. It is not revelation. It is simply a fracture in the story we've been told. A fracture wide enough for a whisper to slip through, and that whisper leads deeper, past the familiar images of white storms and endless snow, towards something older hiding beneath, something that may have been known once, long before the ice, when the world wore a different face, something hinted at, but never answered. Something waiting in the cold, patient and unchanging, as though guarding a history too heavy to speak. What lies beneath a silence that large? What sleeps under a continent buried not just in ice, but in forgetfulness itself? There is a certain unease that lingers long after one leaves the thought of those early maps behind. An unease that grows when turning to the ice itself, as if the continent were whispering through layers of frozen time. What if the strange accuracy of those ancient charts was not the root of the mystery, but only the first loose thread. And what if the deeper unraveling begins not at the surface but far below, in the oldest ice on Earth? Because beneath that silent white desert lies a record the world still struggles to read, a diary written in snowflakes, pressed into a chronology that does not always behave. For decades, scientists drilled into the Antarctic plateau as though it were a vault holding the planet's memories. They trusted the layers to remain perfectly loyal, each snowfall capturing a moment, each compression a year, each deepening band a chapter in Earth's long book. The idea was simple. The deeper the ice, the older the story. Yet the simplicity fractured the moment they reached certain depths and found signals that refused to fit. In the 1970s, the early Vostok ice core astonished researchers with its timeline stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. But within that long climatic tape, there were pulses, abrupt, violent swings in temperature and trapped gases. The Earth, it seemed, did not glide smoothly through time. It lurched, it jolted, it snapped from one state to another so suddenly that entire ecosystems would have had no time to adapt. These abrupt shifts, Heinrich events, Dansgaard-Oeschger oscillations, were like skipped pages, skipped epochs. Not gradual turning, but tearing. What happens to memory during such ruptures? What happens to coastlines, cultures, or any fragile thing living at the world's edge? If Antarctica once knew warmth, forests, rivers, an environment where life flourished, how many times could such a world have vanished before the ice finally sealed it beyond recognition? The ice cores reveal something else. 800,000 years of climate data compressed into a tube thin enough for a person to hold. Within it lie ancient air bubbles, tiny prisons holding atmospheres that smelled nothing like today's. But intertwined with the story of air and temperature lies something far more disquieting. The recognition that the Earth's system has collapsed before, catastrophically, repeatedly. The Younger Dryas, an event so abrupt that temperatures plummeted in mere decades, still leaves scientists arguing about its cause. A comet, a freshwater flood, a change in ocean circulation. The debates remain unresolved, suspended like frost in moonlight. Yet Antarctica's ice remembers all of it. Every disruption, every collapse, every reset. And buried even deeper, beneath miles of frozen pressure, is a silent scientist still cannot explain. Sometimes, an ice layer that should show centuries of deposition shows only years. Sometimes the chemistry jumps violently, as though a whole chapter of Earth's climate vanished. Some researchers have suggested that wind scouring or shifting ice sheets might account for the missing layers. But the explanations never settle comfortably. There is always a leftover uncertainty, a faint tremor in the narrative. Lake Vostok, sealed under nearly 4 kilometers of ice, complicates the quiet further. Its water has been isolated from the surface for perhaps 15 million years, and yet the samples extracted from the surrounding ice reveal genetic traces, microbial fragments that do not easily match known organisms. Some claim contamination. Others insist the anomalies are real. Whether the life found there evolved in isolation or represents ancient branches of biology long gone from the surface, the implication remains the same. Antarctica hides histories not preserved anywhere else on Earth. Biological histories, planetary histories, perhaps even cultural ones, though those would never appear in a test tube. But the place where science feels its most fragile is in time itself. Ice core dating assumes the layers accumulate one by one, faithfully stacked. Yet some studies on compressed ice, particularly in blue ice fields, suggest that older ice can migrate upward, resurfacing where it should not be, like a buried memory resurfacing in the wrong moment, confusing the chronology. If deep ice can move in ways we do not fully understand, then our interpretation of what happened, when it happened, and how quickly it happened becomes a house built on shifting frost. And still, there is the mystery of the warm spots beneath the ice, geothermal heat anomalies that appear in the radar scans like hidden embers. These hot spots defy uniform explanation. Some correspond to known volcanic provinces, but others occur far from any active tectonic feature. In some regions, the heat is so concentrated that it prevents the ice from freezing solid. In others, it forms subglacial lakes tens of kilometers wide. If heat rises from below in uneven pulses, could the ice above have melted and refrozen many times in Earth's recent past? And if so, could shorelines have been exposed, mapped, and then swallowed again before any written history? Even the chronology of the ice itself begins to lose its rigidity when measured against the planet's unpredictable rhythm. The stability we imagine, the slow march of glaciation, falters under scrutiny. Ice sheets can collapse in centuries, sometimes decades. A continent can change its face within the lifespan of a single community. And if that happened in the distant past, long before literacy spread across the world, what memories would remain? Perhaps only stories, myths, maps without explanations. Researchers studying the transition into the last interglacial period found signs of rapid warming in Antarctica, warming so abrupt it defies traditional climate models. Some describe it as a termination event, a moment where the Earth jumped from glacial darkness to relative warmth in an instant, measured not geologically, but historically. The implications are unsettling. If Antarctica once thawed abruptly, might similar events have exposed its land long enough to be charted, only for ice to return just as abruptly? This possibility, though rarely discussed directly, lingers behind the scientific literature like a shadow behind glass. Not a claim, not a conclusion, only an unanswered possibility. Because if even a small fraction of the ice vanished in such a rapid transition, a coastline we consider impossible could have been visible to someone. Not to us, not to modern explorers, but to whoever lived in a world shaped by cycles we no longer remember. And then there is the curious fact that some ice cores show dust layers with mineral compositions matching distant continents: Africa, Australia, South America. Winds carrying ancient dust across oceans suggest vast, turbulent climatic shifts, storms strong enough to relocate entire atmospheres. What would such storms do to human settlements, to coastlines, to memories? Perhaps they do to civilizations what glaciers do to landscapes. Scrape them clean. The more one reads the ice, the more it becomes clear that the story of Antarctica is not one of static cold, but of violence disguised as stillness. Beneath the serene surface lies a history of upheaval so extreme that anything built during those cycles would be wiped away without a single trace. The ice would seal the land, smooth it, erase it with indifference. And yet, something in the untouched silence feels deliberate, as though the continent were not merely a witness to Earth's upheavals, but also a keeper of whatever survived them. A keeper of interruptions, of gaps, of events too abrupt to fully grasp. The maps that should not exist, the ice layers that refuse to behave, the microbes whose origins remain unanchored. Each is a gentle pressure against the boundaries of what we think we know. If the ice can erase epochs and reveal them again in disordered fragments, then how many times has Antarctica shown itself to the world, only to retreat again under a white curtain? And if it has done this before, if it has appeared and vanished like a breath drawn and released, then who first saw it during one of those brief exposures? And what else did they see before the cold returned? There is a certain strangeness that lingers after contemplating the ice. an echo that follows the mind into the next thought, like a faint trail left by something moving just beneath the surface. If the layers of frozen time can flicker, rearrange, or vanish, then what else might the ice be hiding? What might lie not within the ice, but under it? Because when scientists first began to pull back the white curtain using radar, peering through miles of compressed snow into the dark architecture below, they found a landscape that should not exist. A landscape that tells a story far older, far warmer, and far more complicated than the silence above it suggests. Under Antarctica's endless white, the world does not flatten into featureless desolation. It rises into mountain ranges, plunges into deep valleys, and stretches into coastlines shaped by rivers that no longer flow. The most startling of these hidden regions is the Gombortsev subglacial mountains, an entire alpine range the size of the Alps, entombed beneath more than 2 kilometers of ice. Sharp peaks, deep basins, ridgelines carved by water, not ice. A mountain range with no visible origin story. Geologists still debate how such a young-looking range could be so old, or how it remained so mysteriously preserved. The existence of these hidden peaks raises a quiet contradiction. If Antarctica has been frozen for millions of years, how have these mountains avoided erosion? How did water carve valleys that have not seen sunlight since long before humans existed? Some propose that the mountains formed during earlier geological periods, and that the ice shielded them from erosion. Others suggest cycles of glaciation that came and went, exposing the land in intervals we can no longer trace. But behind each explanation lies the same unresolved tension. This landscape feels like a memory of a world that once lived, where only death now reigns. More radar surveys revealed buried river systems, vast networks that resemble the drainage patterns of continents in temperate climates, deep channels carved by flowing water frozen in time, rivers that carried sediments, shaped deltas, fed into larger basins. They are not the work of glaciers grinding rock into dust. They are the signatures of liquid water, persistent and free. If the land beneath the ice once hosted rivers, then the ice must have come later, much later, and perhaps more suddenly than we dare to imagine. One of the most surprising discoveries lies near the coast of Princess Elizabeth Land, a subglacial basin so large and so sharply defined that it appears on radar like the ghost of an ancient shoreline. Some research teams believe it may have once been an estuary, a place where water met open sea, where ecosystems flourished under a climate nothing like today. To see a coastline under the ice is to glimpse a world lost not to time, but to concealment. It is to see a shape that should belong in a mapmaker's notebook, not buried under miles of frozen weight. And the radar keeps revealing more. Buried fjords, U-shaped valleys, plateaus that mirror those found in regions known to have been populated by early life. The topography under Antarctica looks eerily similar to continents that have hosted civilizations, animals, forests. It is a land with contours that speak of habitation, not necessarily human, but alive. A living world that the ice overpowered. When these images first emerged, some scientists compared them to the maps of Antarctica drawn centuries ago. The resemblance is not perfect, but the suggestion is there, faint and persistent, like a whisper through static. A coastline beneath the ice and a coastline drawn on parchment. How do two impossibilities meet? Are they connected? Or is the resemblance just another coincidence that pushes the mind into unwelcome questions? The deeper one descends into the radar data, the more difficult it becomes to maintain the clean timeline offered by textbooks. Antarctica does not behave like a land that has been static for 30 million years. Its features feel too young, too preserved, too abruptly interrupted. If the ice had always been there, its weight would have flattened the mountains long ago. But the Gamburtsev peaks remain sharp, almost defiant, as though they have only recently fallen asleep. And then there is the issue of rebounded crust, the way continents rise or fall depending on the weight above them. Scientists note that in regions where ice recently melted, the land slowly lifts as the crust decompresses. Yet in parts of Antarctica, there are signs of rebound far greater than expected. Signs that suggest the ice sheet may have collapsed and reformed multiple times. Signs that hint at warm periods, recent warm periods, that remain unexplained in the standard model. Combined with the valleys and hidden coasts, these clues suggest a story where Antarctica was not perpetually frozen, but shifted between worlds. A story where warmth returned, briefly, unexpectedly, and then vanished. A story written in the geological equivalent of heartbeat spikes, short-lived, intense pulses. If such pulses occurred within the time of early humans, or even pre-human cultures capable of navigation, then the presence of ancient maps becomes less impossible. Not proven, never proven, but less impossible. Some researchers have dared to propose that parts of the Antarctic continent were ice-free much later than assumed, perhaps even during the last interglacial period around 120,000 years ago. Others suggest smaller pockets of exposed land that could have been mapped during earlier warm anomalies. These claims remain debated, contested, resisted. To accept them would require rewriting large sections of Earth's climatic history, and few are eager to open that door. But a door does not cease to exist simply because it remains closed. Even today, the ice hides lakes, over 400 of them, sealed in darkness, surrounded by landscapes that should not exist. Some lakes lie at elevations inconsistent with known hydrological cycles, as though they were remnants of older worlds trapped beneath the freeze. If lakes survived the ice, could coastlines have survived too? Could entire regions have lingered, half buried, half exposed, long enough for someone to chart them before they vanished for good? This possibility often meets silence, not rejection, perhaps because silence is easier. Antarctica resists narratives that move in straight lines. It prefers stories that loop, overlap, dissolve. Its geography is a palimpsest, one world etched over another, each line half erased. And beneath the final layer, beneath the cold, beneath the quiet, rests a topography that feels like the trace of a life that ended without a witness. If the mountains below the ice are young in shape but ancient in age, if the valleys were carved by rivers instead of glaciers, if the coastlines align with maps drawn long before their discovery, then what exactly is the story we are being asked to believe? Is it the story of a continent frozen for eons? Or is it the story of a continent that froze abruptly, catastrophically, wiping away whatever existed before? The mind drifts to a final question, soft but unrelenting. If this hidden landscape once breathed the open air, then who was there when it did? And what did they leave behind before the ice sealed the world? There is a quiet shiver that follows the thought of a lost landscape beneath the ice, an unease that deepens when the story moves from geological ghosts to human footsteps. Because once the hidden mountains and drowned coastlines are glimpsed through radar, the question becomes far harder to avoid. If the land beneath Antarctica once breathed open air, then who was the first to sense it, long before the modern world claimed discovery? That question lingers like a draft at the back of old archives, where the earliest polar expeditions left behind journals filled not only with observations, but with silences. Silences that feel deliberate, as though something unwritten traveled with them. The early 20th century is often portrayed as the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. Names echo through the pages of history: Amundsen, Scott, Shackleton, Bird. Men who crossed a boundary the world had forgotten. Men whose journeys were recorded in photographs, letters, and newspapers. And yet, within the vast documentation, there are faint contradictions, details that remain strangely out of place, sentences that read like they were written with one hand, while the other tried to erase something. Roald Amundsen, the first to reach the South Pole, left a note describing the landscape as older than anything alive. Not older as in ancient, older as in remembered. A strange phrasing, easily dismissed as poetic, yet unsettling when placed beside what modern scans reveal beneath the ice. Why describe a land he believed freshly discovered as though it carried the weight of a forgotten world? Captain Robert Falcon Scott, in his final tragic diary entries, mentioned peculiar formations glimpsed during storms, shapes he did not have the strength to elaborate on, or perhaps did not dare. The words fade into the page, interrupted by the slow collapse of his team. But the ambiguity remains. What had he seen in those whiteout distances that he chose not to name? And then there was Ernest Shackleton, whose ship, the Endurance, was trapped and crushed by ice in 1915. Those who survived reported strange atmospheric distortions, mirages that bent light in ways unlike typical polar refractions. Some spoke of forms that looked like cliffs where none should be, or shadows that stretched too long across the horizon. These accounts were minimized in official reports, reduced to illusions brought on by exhaustion and hunger. But mirages do not typically resemble structures. They do not mimic topography that later radar scans confirm exists beneath the ice. But the strangest silence belongs to Admiral Richard E. Byrd, a man whose expeditions were lavishly funded, whose missions were recorded meticulously, whose flights remained unmatched in their ambition. He flew farther south than any before him, over regions no one had ever seen, carrying scientific instruments, cameras, and a diary he would later guard closely. His first major Antarctic operation was in the late 1920s, but it was his post-World War II mission, Operation High Jump in 1946-47, that stirs the most enduring questions. Because High Jump was too large, far too large. Officially a scientific expedition, it deployed over 4,700 men, 13 ships, and dozens of aircraft in what remains, even now, one of the most extensive operations ever launched in peacetime. Why would such force be needed to study ice and penguins? Military archives describe it simply as research. Journalists at the time found the explanation so insufficient that some papers openly questioned it. The mission ended suddenly, months earlier than scheduled. No solid explanation followed. Some reports described aircraft losses attributed to weather. Others mentioned unidentified hazards. In Byrd's own notes, which were never fully released, he wrote cryptic phrases: barriers not made of ice, zones of abnormal warmth, areas where the instruments behaved strangely. Scholars argue over the meaning. Some say Byrd exaggerated. Others say the notes are misinterpreted. But the words sit heavily nonetheless, especially when placed beside the scientific anomalies known today. Subglacial lakes, geothermal hotspots, magnetic distortions. Researchers have since documented regions of Antarctica where the magnetic field dips sharply, where compasses behave as if confused, where the crust thins unexpectedly, and where heat rises from below for reasons still debated. If Byrd encountered such zones with mid-century navigation systems, his experiences would have been deeply unsettling. Perhaps what he described as barriers were not walls, but invisible distortions, regions where the land beneath the ice twisted the very instruments used to measure it. And yet, there is still something in his writing that feels more personal, more observational, as though he sensed something the instruments could not record, some shape, some presence masked by distance and storm. He wrote of vast expanses that feel structured, an odd phrase for a place believed to be empty wilderness. He wrote of warm currents beneath cold skies, decades before geothermal anomalies beneath the ice were discovered. And he wrote of areas that appeared forbidden, though he did not say to whom. Operation High Jump's sudden termination cemented a lingering suspicion that Antarctica held something too complicated, too politically sensitive, or too destabilizing to leave in the hands of a single nation. Within a decade, the Antarctic Treaty would declare the continent a place of peace, research, and strict territorial neutrality. A place where no country could claim land, where military activity was restricted, where certain zones became off-limits without public explanation. Officially, the treaty protects the environment and preserves the continent for science. Unofficially, quietly, its timing has raised questions. Why did the world's rival powers agree so swiftly, so unanimously, to seal away a barren land? Why negotiate neutrality over a continent declared worthless only decades earlier? The Antarctic Treaty is often celebrated as a triumph of diplomacy. But diplomacy rarely arises from indifference. It arises from necessity, from urgency, from the need to prevent access to something sensitive, or dangerous, or simply unknown. The early explorers themselves left hints of that unknown, not in what they wrote, but in what they avoided writing, in the places where sentences closed too soon, where their tone shifted, where the details grew vague. These silences form a pattern that mirrors the hidden geography beneath the ice. Both the land and the historical record bear the marks of erasure. The official narrative of Antarctic exploration is clean, triumphant, orderly. But the primary sources, diaries, field logs, private reflections, tell a story full of interruptions, strange weather, sudden equipment failures, unexplained heat, mirages that defied optical theory, encounters not with creatures or inventions, but with landscapes that seemed inconsistent. It is not the presence of extraordinary claims that unsettles the mind, but the absence of ordinary consistency. The way so many explorers, separated by decades, hint at the same peculiar distortions. The way they wrote around certain experiences rather than through them, as if they sensed that the world would not accept certain truths, or that they themselves lacked the language to articulate what they witnessed. As the white horizon swallowed their footprints, each returned with an unspoken impression that Antarctica was not simply a place of cold. It was a place of concealment, a continent that holds its history the way the ice holds its lakes, sealed, pressurized, waiting. If so many expeditions encountered hints of something beneath the surface, something structural, something forbidden, then what exactly did they glimpse through the flickering veil of storm and distortion? And why does the silence in their notes feel heavier than anything they chose to describe? There is a quiet inevitability that follows the exploration logs, the sense that human witnesses, for all their courage, only skim the surface of something much older. To look beneath the ice is to glimpse a world that contradicts the simplicity of our timelines. But to look further back, into the geological record of Antarctica before the freeze, is to confront a stranger contradiction. That this continent, now a monument of desolation, once bloomed with life abundant enough to rival entire hemispheres. And that its sudden transformation from warm forest to frozen tomb may not fit neatly into the slow, gradual story we were taught to accept. The fossils tell the first part of the story, though even they seem to speak in fragments, as though reluctant to reveal too much. Beneath the ice, scientists have found traces of ancient forests, tree trunks, pollen, impressions of ferns that once unfurled under a sunlit sky. In some regions, the remains of beech trees appear, descendants of an ecosystem that should belong in temperate climates, not the coldest place on Earth. In others, the imprints of cycads, conifers, and flowering plants rest where no plant has grown for millions of years. The fossils are not hints. They are declarations. Antarctica was once green. Antarctica was once warm. Antarctica once held life so rich that rivers fed forests, and forests fed ecosystems woven through millennia. Even more startling are the dinosaur remains. Ankylosaurs, ornithopods, cryolophosaurs, creatures that moved through landscapes now buried beneath kilometers of ice. Their bones suggest forests stretching across vast territories, where temperatures rarely dipped below freezing. And in one region, scientists found the mummified remains of a tree trunk so intact that its ancient growth rings still show the rhythm of its seasons. Seasons in a land that, today, has none. Geologists attribute this warmth to the continent's former position within Gondwana, to shifts in Earth's orbit, to atmospheric compositions long lost. And while these explanations are plausible, they become less comfortable when combined with evidence of extremely rapid shifts. Periods where Antarctica plunged into cold with astonishing speed. Some studies indicate that parts of the continent experienced a sudden freeze around 14 million years ago, a cooling event far more abrupt than typical glaciation patterns. Others suggest rapid ice expansion as recently as the late Pliocene, events measured not in millions of years, but in thousands. What could force a continent to freeze so quickly, ending forests that thrive for tens of millions of years? Volcanoes, atmospheric collapse, ocean current disruption, or something more cyclical, an event that has occurred before and perhaps will occur again. The geological story of Antarctica seems less like a stable timeline and more like a pulse, warming, cooling, erasing, resetting, each pulse sweeping away whatever came before, each pulse sealing the land beneath a deeper shroud. The most enigmatic pieces of this puzzle come from the sediments extracted beneath the ice. In some cores, the soil still contains organic matter, leaf fragments, spores, ancient DNA, preserved as though the ice arrived too quickly for decay to complete its work. These remnants suggest the transition from forest to glacier may have been far more sudden than the slow-motion story typically told. The land did not gradually succumb to cold. It was engulfed, buried, quieted, and then there is the strange presence of microfossils found unexpectedly in places where they should not be. Foraminifera, marine microorganisms, embedded in sediments deep inland, as though ocean waters once reached far into the continental interior. Some researchers propose ancient seaways. Others suggest catastrophic flooding events. Either explanation challenges the image of Antarctica as a stable frozen monolith. Instead, it behaves like a continent shaped by upheaval, not stillness. Even more puzzling is the evidence of warm-adapted species, beetles, plants, and microbial communities, whose genetic traces imply survival long into periods where they should have been impossible. In some layers, DNA fragments suggest ecosystems more recent than the geological consensus allows. Critics argue contamination. Supporters counter that the samples were taken from deep, sealed environments. As always, the truth sits in a quiet space between certainty and doubt. One of the most curious discoveries emerged from a 2017 study in West Antarctica, where radar imaging revealed patterns in the bedrock that resembled tree root systems, vast, intertwined networks consistent with large forests, preserved beneath the ice sheet. The patterns were too structured, too organized to be random. They looked like the last echoes of a landscape frozen mid-breath, as though the cold descended faster than the forest could fall. All this raises an uncomfortable tension. If Antarctica could shift from lush temperate forest to frozen desert abruptly, and perhaps repeatedly, then how many cycles remain unknown? And during those cycles, how often did the land lie exposed, inviting habitation, exploration, mapping? How many worlds could rise and vanish in such intervals? How many stories could be erased in a single climatic lurch? Scientists often focus on the ancient past, millions of years ago. But some lines of evidence, though cautiously discussed, point toward more recent warmth. Ice core melt signatures, anomalies in oxygen isotopes, unexpected sediment patterns, all hint at interglacial pulses where parts of the Antarctic coast may have thawed far later than the standard model suggests. Perhaps tens of thousands of years ago. Perhaps even within the span of early Homo sapiens. These suggestions remain controversial, resisted, debated. But their presence in scientific literature is undeniable. And then there is the magnetic story. Subtle, quiet, but powerful. Antarctica's crust contains regions with anomalously strong or weak magnetic signatures, areas geologists describe as inconsistent with the surrounding terrain. Some interpret these anomalies as evidence of ancient impact events. Others suggest geological structures older than the continent as we know it. A few speculate about crustal shifts that redistributed land masses in ways not yet fully understood. Each explanation adds another layer to the enigma. The land beneath Antarctica may be older, more complex, more fractured than the ice above allows us to perceive. Taken together, these fragments form a picture that refuses to resolve. Forests that should not exist. Sediments that froze too quickly. Rivers that carved valleys beneath what should have been eternal ice. Microfossils inland where only ocean should have touched. A continent too dynamic to match the tidy timeline handed down through textbooks. If Antarctica could host forests for millions of years, and if it could freeze abruptly enough to preserve those forests in place, then what else might lie beneath? Preserved in pockets, trapped in lakes, hidden in sediments untouched by air since the world was warm. Could remnants of early human presence exist there, swept away before they could fossilize? Could coastlines once visible for centuries or millennia be now buried beyond reach? Perhaps the greatest contradiction lies not in the fossils, but in the silence that surrounds them. Because if the geological record reveals a continent that transformed violently, then why does our larger historical narrative insist on calm, slow change? Why does the world prefer a timeline without ruptures, without sudden shifts, without room for erasure? And if nature itself shows that Antarctica was once alive, warm, and open to the world, then what else might have lived there? Before the cold erased every trace, there is a moment, after wandering through the fossil forests and ancient rivers of Antarctica, when the mind begins to drift toward an older, stranger question, one that does not belong to science alone. If the land beneath the ice once stood open to the world, warm and reachable, then how did so many ancient cultures, scattered across continents, speak of a southern realm they should not have known? The idea appears and reappears in antiquity like a shadow cast by a fire no one admits is burning. A memory without a clear source, a direction whispered rather than mapped, and perhaps that whisper, faint yet persistent, is the clearest sign that something was once seen, once known, long before the ice reclaimed its throne. The Greeks called it Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. Ptolemy, writing in the 2nd century, insisted that a great continent must exist far to the south to balance the lands of the north. This is often explained as philosophical symmetry, not evidence. But the odd thing is the detail. Ptolemy described proportions and boundaries that bear a peculiar resemblance to the true mass of Antarctica. Not exact, but suggestive in a way that defies pure imagination. Scholars argue that his southern land was hypothetical. And yet, the hypothesis aligns uncannily with something real. Why imagine a land so large, so specific, unless fragments of memory reached him through sources now lost? Centuries later, Arab geographers spoke of a southern region, cold beyond measure. A land touched by long nights and long days, and yet reachable by those who ventured far enough. Ibn Khaldun wrote of sailors who glimpsed shadowed coasts in the far south. The accounts were vague, carried through oral stories, migration routes, and maritime speculation. But they existed, persistent, recurring, quietly contradicting the idea that the far south was forever unknown. Even more intriguing are the Polynesian traditions. Although debated, some ethnographers have documented oral histories describing voyages far into southern waters, journeys chasing birds, storms, and the great wandering albatross. These stories do not speak explicitly of Antarctica, yet they speak of cold lands, drifting ice, and skies that stretch too long. Perhaps exaggerations, perhaps metaphors, or perhaps faint memories passed down from navigators who pushed far beyond the zones we now assume they reached. The Polynesians crossed the Pacific with accuracy that stunned European explorers. Their navigational knowledge remains one of the greatest achievements in human history. To dismiss their southern stories as mere myth is to ignore a pattern found across several cultures, an intuition of a land many centuries before its official discovery. Then there are the maps. Maps created long after Ptolemy, yet long before the modern age. Maps that show a southern land that should not be there, or show it too clearly, too confidently. Some scholars attribute these shapes to misinterpretations of other continents. Others suggest copying errors. But the recurrence of a southern land, not as fantasy but as geographic expectation, raises a quiet doubt, as though cartographers were not inventing something new, but preserving something old, inherited through channels we can no longer trace. This notion of inherited knowledge appears in many cultures. The idea that wisdom can outlast the people who possessed it, that maps, stories, and fragments of understanding survive long after the events they describe have been forgotten. Knowledge slipping through time like a relic carried across generations, losing clarity, but retaining direction. Could Antarctica be one of those relics? A memory carved not into stone or text, but into myth, repeated until its origins were lost. Some historians have pointed to the medieval concept of Ultima Thule, a land of fog, cold, and unreachable distance. Most place Thule somewhere near Iceland or the Faroe Islands. But some ancient writers described it as far beyond what could realistically be the northern world. A place of floating ice, a sun that hovered, and days that vanished into nights. The descriptions sound confused, drifting, inconsistent. Yet they echo faintly the way modern explorers speak of Antarctica's extremes. Could memories of polar regions have been displaced in time, retold, distorted, but fundamentally based on something witnessed once? The Aboriginal peoples of Australia also hold myths of a southern land, a realm of spirits, cold winds, and ancestral journeys. These stories are symbolic metaphors for the underworld, not geography. And yet, the consistent directionality, the sense of a profound south, appears again and again. Symbols are not maps, but symbols often preserve truths too dangerous or too sacred to state plainly. Collectively, none of these references prove anything, but they form a constellation of suggestion, a repeating pattern across civilizations that had no contact with each other. a pattern that points toward an awareness of a southern realm long before official history acknowledges such awareness. This recurrence is what unsettles the mind, not the certainty of connection, but the persistence of the motif. Why would so many cultures imagine a land they supposedly could not have seen? Why build mythologies around a place beyond the edge of the known world? In some traditions, the southern land is not merely a geographic mystery, but a philosophical one. A symbol of endings, of death, of cycles closing. The south becomes a direction associated with loss, with silence, with things taken back by the world. It is uncanny how closely this symbolism mirrors Antarctica's geological story. A place that has repeatedly erased itself, buried its warm past beneath ice, concealed every trace of life that once flourished there. Perhaps ancient myths grasped a truth science would not uncover until millennia later. That the far south is a place where memory goes to sleep. One of the most intriguing linguistic traces comes from the medieval Latin term terra australis nondum cognita, the southern land not yet known. The phrase sounds straightforward, yet its formulation implies not that the land was imaginary, but that it was known in some fashion, just not recently, not yet known, not never known. As though something once recognized had slipped into absence. The phrasing is strange, subtle, and easily overlooked. But once noticed, it does not leave. It suggests a gap, a forgetting, a silence where knowledge once lived. And if silence exists in both geological and cultural memory, if Antarctica is a place repeatedly lost, erased, rediscovered, forgotten, then perhaps the ancient world carried a faint, fading echo of an earlier encounter. An encounter not preserved through historical records, but through myth, symbol, cartographic shadows. The edges of a story too tattered to reconstruct yet too persistent to dismiss. What remains most mysterious is the sense of accuracy embedded within these ancient references. Not exact accuracy, never enough to be considered proof, but directional, conceptual, symbolic accuracy. A feeling that these cultures were reaching towards something real, something large, something hidden far to the south. Perhaps these echoes are nothing more than coincidence, an alignment of imagination separated by space and time. Or perhaps they are fragments of a memory the world once shared, passed down through channels now invisible to us. Knowledge buried like a fossil beneath cultural sediment. Knowledge that refuses to vanish fully, resurfacing in stories, myths, and maps like a whisper breaking through snow. If so many civilizations carried an intuition of a land they supposedly never reached, then what exactly are we remembering through them? And how many layers of that memory remain hidden, waiting, sealed beneath an ocean of ice? There is a particular quiet that settles over the mind when thinking about ancient whispers of the South. A quiet that deepens when one begins to consider the tools those cultures possessed, the instruments they used to cross oceans, to read stars, to trace coastlines we assume they never reached. Because even if the myths of Terra Australis were symbolic, even if no ancient mariner ever set foot on Antarctic shores, there remains a stranger contradiction hidden in plain sight. Certain artifacts from the ancient world show a level of navigational sophistication that does not comfortably match the timeline assigned to humanity. And when those artifacts are placed beside the enigmatic southern maps, a pattern emerges, one that is subtle, fragile, but difficult to dismiss. Some say navigation began in earnest only a few centuries ago, with the refinement of longitude measurements and the arrival of precise instruments. But the ancient world left behind devices that complicate that narrative. The Antikythera mechanism is the most famous, a bronze gearwork machine recovered from a shipwreck more than 2,000 years old, capable of predicting planetary motions, eclipses, and complex astronomical cycles with a precision matched only by clocks built in the 18th century. Its existence is not speculative. Its gears have been studied, scanned, reconstructed. It functions exactly as a mechanical model of the heavens. The question is not whether it worked. The question is how such knowledge came to exist so early, in isolation, and without any surviving lineage that explains its emergence. If the ancient Greeks possessed mechanisms of such sophistication, what else did they know about the world beyond their borders? Some researchers note that the device could track the metonic cycle, the Saros cycle, and the movements of constellations vital to navigation. Tools like this were not decorative. They were guides. They were memory embedded in metal, and the Greeks were not alone. Polynesian navigators crossed thousands of miles of open ocean using star paths, wave patterns, and subtle atmospheric cues, methods so advanced that Western sailors could not comprehend them. Arab mariners developed astrolabes capable of determining latitude with remarkable accuracy. Chinese astronomers created star charts of enormous precision. These cultures did not possess modern technology, but they carried something more elusive: accumulated knowledge, refined over generations, passed through oral teaching, symbol, and ritual. Knowledge that could allow a person to follow currents invisible to most of us. If such navigators pushed farther than expected, if they inherited fragments of older maritime traditions, then the idea of mapping a distant southern coastline during some transient warm period becomes less fantastical. Not proven, not even likely by conventional measures, but no longer unthinkable. Knowledge does not always move forward. Sometimes it loops, it disappears, it returns in broken forms. The real question is not whether ancient navigators could have reached Antarctica, but whether they possessed information inherited from sources now lost. Civilizations rise and fall, and with them, their libraries, their instruments, their maps. Fires burn manuscripts. Floodwaters erase coastlines. Languages shift, but certain fragments endure. The Antikythera mechanism is one such fragment, a surviving piece of a technological lineage that went dark for nearly 2 millennia. If such a device emerged from the wreckage of time, what others might have vanished completely? And then there is the Piri Reis map. Critics often emphasize that its southern landmass is a misinterpretation of South America. But the details do not rest easily on that explanation. The map includes a stretch of coastline that matches, with unsettling closeness, features found beneath Antarctica's ice today. Features known only from 20th century radar scans. The map also contains annotations claiming it was drawn from sources dating back to the time of Alexander, themselves copied from older documents. Piri Reis did not invent the coastline, he synthesized it. The question becomes, from what? If the sources he used were themselves copies of copies, handed down through centuries, then the information could be ancient indeed, carried across empires, languages, and epochs, until its origin became unrecognizable. This is how knowledge survives extinction, not intact, but as a ghost, fragmented yet persistent. Modern readers often dismiss the idea of ancient global mapping as romantic speculation, but the existence of early instruments, astrolabes, star compasses, mechanical models, suggests that maritime cultures possessed a deeper understanding of the world than we acknowledge. And while no artifact proves a civilization mapped Antarctica, the cumulative hints suggest that the ancient world may have inherited shadows of older knowledge. Knowledge that originated during a climatic window where southern lands were not completely hidden. Knowledge preserved imperfectly, then lost again when the climate sealed the land beneath ice. But the story deepens, becoming stranger, when we consider other anomalous tools and findings. In 1976, researchers discovered the remains of what appeared to be an ancient navigational stone in Polynesia, a basalt tool etched with patterns that some interpret as stellar coordinates. In the Indian Ocean, fragments of ancient star globes have been found, bearing constellations mapped with precision that challenges conventional timelines. In Egypt, inscriptions depict what appear to be celestial observations aligned with precession, a phenomenon whose cycle lasts 26,000 years. These artifacts do not speak of Antarctica. They speak of the capacity to know the world. They remind us that civilization is not a straight line of progress, but a wave, rising, falling, carrying knowledge between peaks and troughs. If the troughs last long enough, the source of that knowledge vanishes, leaving only echoes. And perhaps the greatest echo of all is the consistent appearance of southern imagery, not just in maps, but in cosmology. In some traditions, the south is aligned with forgotten stars, constellations visible only from latitudes closer to Antarctica. Aboriginal Australian skylore includes depictions of the southern dark emu, a constellation traced not by stars, but by voids in the Milky Way, an observation requiring deep familiarity with the southern sky. If ancient observers tracked southern constellations with such care, did they also track the horizon beneath them? Did they chart the world that lay at that southern edge? Knowledge preserved in stone, metal, myth, and map. Knowledge oscillating through time. Knowledge hinting at something just beyond reach. We tend to assume that humanity began truly understanding the world only recently. But the artifacts argue otherwise. They suggest a hidden lineage of observation, one cut, interrupted, erased by catastrophes both natural and historical. The Toba eruption, the Younger Dryas, sea level pulses, cultural collapses, wars, fires, migrations. Each event fractures memory. Each event silences libraries. Each event resets what a civilization can know. So, when ancient maps show hints of Antarctic coastlines, perhaps they are not glimpses of direct exploration. Perhaps they are fragments of an inheritance, scraps of knowledge passed through civilizations whose origins lie deeper than we realize, further back than our current models comfortably allow. If so, then the question becomes not who first mapped Antarctica, but how many times the knowledge had to be rediscovered, how many cycles of understanding rose and fell before finally fading into myth and silence. And if navigation itself carries the echoes of forgotten epochs, then what other remnants of those epochs still lie hidden, waiting beneath the ice, waiting in the shadows of history, waiting to be recognized for what they truly are? There is a moment, after drifting through ancient instruments and inherited knowledge, when the mind begins to notice a subtler pattern, one that does not belong to maps or myths or artifacts, but to the earth itself. A pattern written not in ink or memory, but in the shifting pulse of the planet's magnetic field. Because what lies beneath Antarctica is not only buried landscapes and forgotten coastlines, but something even more elusive, something that resists being seen in any conventional sense. A distortion, a weakness, a quiet but persistent anomaly that has caused instruments to falter, explorers to hesitate, and researchers to grow strangely silent when certain questions rise too close to the surface. The magnetic field is often imagined as stable and protective, a gentle envelope shielding life from the sun. But in reality, it is restless, tilting, wandering, weakening, strengthening in cycles beyond human duration. And nowhere is this restlessness more evident than near the poles. The Antarctic region, in particular, behaves like a place where the Earth forgets its own rules. Compasses drift unpredictably. Instruments misread directions. Geological surveys reveal patterns that do not follow the logic seen elsewhere. One of the strangest of these is the Wilkes Land gravity anomaly, a massive circular feature deep beneath the ice, first detected by satellite measurements in the early 2000s. It spans more than 200 miles across and seems to plunge far deeper into the crust than typical geological formations. Some researchers argue it might be the scar of an ancient impact event, perhaps one large enough to alter the global climate long before written history. Others suggest it is a region of anomalous density, a knot in the crust where the planet's ancient past has folded over itself. Whatever its origin, it exerts a gravitational signature powerful enough to distort instruments flying above it. A presence not seen, but felt. Then there is the Southern Hemisphere magnetic anomaly, zones where the magnetic field weakens for reasons that remain debated. These regions stretch across the southern oceans and brush the fringes of Antarctica. Pilots have reported interference as far back as the mid-20th century, long before satellite mapping revealed the underlying irregularities. Early expeditions described wandering needles, compasses that seemed to hesitate, as though torn between conflicting instructions. These anomalies were attributed to poor equipment at the time. Now, the scientific literature acknowledges something deeper. The poles shift not only across the surface, but within the Earth's core. And Antarctica sits above a region where these shifts express themselves most dramatically. As researchers deployed magnetometers across the continent, they found patterns that defied expectations. Magnetic signatures that suggested buried structures, ridges, and inconsistencies. Some were natural. Some looked unfamiliar, like formations whose origins had been overwritten by ice. Each anomaly told a different story. A story of a land that had moved, fractured, reconfigured. A story of forces rising from below, shaping the ice above in ways not yet understood. Radar surveys also revealed geothermal hotspots scattered beneath the ice sheet, areas where heat rises from the crust with unexpected strength. Some align with known volcanic provinces, others do not. In some places, the heat is so intense that the ice above remains thin, melting into lakes despite the overwhelming cold. And in the deepest regions, where the bedrock sinks into ancient basins, geothermal heat has formed networks of subglacial waterways, rivers flowing unseen, guided by warmth rather than gravity. These rivers carve channels beneath the ice, altering its movement, reshaping its surface. They form a hidden circulatory system the world did not know existed until recently. Some scientists propose that these hotspots may be remnants of an old tectonic boundary, a region where the crust remains fractured and active. Others suggest mantle plumes, ancient heat rising from the core. But there is another possibility, one seldom mentioned, yet persistent in quiet discussions, that Antarctica did not simply freeze in place, but moved. That the continent underwent a true polar shift, a reorientation of the crust itself, repositioning land closer to the pole in a geological instant. This is not the fictional pole shift often misused by sensational theories, but a concept rooted in legitimate geophysics known as true polar wander. It has occurred before. It may occur again. And if it happened rapidly at some point in the ancient past, it could explain why Antarctica's warm forests froze suddenly, why its coastlines lie buried, why its magnetic field behaves like a wound still healing. Even more curious is how such anomalies intersect with the historical record. Many early expeditions encountered regions where neither compass nor radio behaved as expected. Later missions confronted zones where aircraft instruments flickered or failed. High-frequency communications degraded unexpectedly. These encounters were minimized in reports, dismissed as atmospheric interference or equipment malfunction. But the repetition across decades and across separate expeditions invites a quieter question. What kind of land generates such persistent distortion? When the United States, Russia, and several other nations established research stations in the mid-20th century, they placed them strategically, but not always where the terrain or climate seemed most favorable. Some stations were placed far inland, directly above regions known for magnetic or geothermal irregularities. Officially, these locations were chosen for scientific interest. Unofficially, the reasoning remains opaque. Why concentrate so much research effort on areas known for instrument disruption? Why do so many stations lie within reach of subglacial lakes, gravity anomalies, or geothermal hotspots? The pattern is subtle but unmistakable. The Antarctic Treaty, signed in 1959, imposed strict limitations on military activity and territorial claims. It declared the continent a place of peace, science, and neutrality. But it also created a framework of controlled access. Large areas of the interior remain difficult to reach without special permissions. Certain valleys, ridges, and zones near the magnetic anomalies are seldom visited, seldom studied, seldom discussed. The official explanation is environmental protection. Yet the restrictions predate the ecological era by decades. They emerged not from modern conservation, but from Cold War geopolitics, and something else that remains unspoken. Even today, satellite data from certain regions is oddly incomplete, as though scanning passes are interrupted or filtered. When questioned, researchers cite technical limitations. But the gaps persist, precisely over areas where the anomalies lie. It is not proof of concealment. It is not evidence of anything sinister. It is simply one more inconsistency in a story filled with them. One more question suspended in the air like frost that never quite melts. There is a growing sense among some geologists that Antarctica may hold the key to episodes of Earth's history that no longer fit within neat timelines. Episodes where the planet shifted abruptly, where climates reversed in decades, where oceans surged, where magnetic poles swung like pendulums. If such events occurred, they would have the power to erase entire civilizations, alter coastlines, and scatter knowledge across continents. They would leave scars in rock and ice, scars we now detect as anomalies. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is the simplest one, that the distortions beneath Antarctica are not merely geological or magnetic, but chronological. That the land itself has experienced ruptures in time, cycles of exposure and burial so rapid that memory could not keep up. The ice hides landscapes too young to be ancient and too old to be recent. The magnetic field stirs like a restless animal beneath the crust. The heat pulses as if something below still moves, still breathes. If Antarctica sits atop a wound in the planet's memory, then the anomalies we measure are not errors. They are reminders. But reminders of what? That the world resets itself. That history is fragile. That knowledge can vanish faster than ice can form. Or that somewhere beneath that frozen horizon lies a story the Earth has tried and failed to silence. And if the magnetic veil hides more than geology, if it conceals a deeper rupture, a deeper loss, what else might be waiting beneath the ice, just beyond the reach of our trembling instruments? There is a strange heaviness that settles when one contemplates the magnetic scars beneath the ice. The sense that the Earth itself has undergone shocks so deep, so sudden, that entire chapters of its past were erased before they could be written. And it is here, in this uneasy quiet, that another pattern rises into view. Because Antarctica's anomalies, its hidden mountains, its forgotten rivers, its shifting magnetic field, begin to echo something larger, something woven through the entire story of our planet. The cycles of collapse that reset the world again and again, leaving only fragments behind for future ages to puzzle over. Humanity tends to imagine history as a single upward line, slow, fragile progress toward the present. But the geological record tells a very different story, one shaped not by continuity, but by rupture. The Earth has experienced catastrophes so intense that they reshaped continents, extinguished ecosystems, and erased whatever memory earlier beings may have held. Volcanic winters, shifts in ocean currents, sudden glacial surges, pulses of meltwater that drowned coasts in days. And each time, Antarctica was both witness and participant. Its ice locked away evidence of these upheavals like a vault sealing documents after the empire that wrote them had fallen. In its layers lie signatures of global resets, thin, abrupt lines that indicate volcanic ash from the Toba eruption 74,000 years ago, chemical anomalies suggesting massive freshwater floods, sudden spikes in trapped greenhouse gases. Each one marks an interruption in the planet's continuity. Each one hints at the fragility of the world as we know it. One of the most dramatic of these events occurred near the end of the last ice age, the Younger Dryas, a period when temperatures plummeted with astonishing speed. Some regions cooled 10 degrees in less than a human lifetime. Entire ecosystems vanished. Sea levels froze in place. And for a moment, the world seemed to rewind. The cause remains debated. Perhaps a massive influx of glacial meltwater into the North Atlantic. Perhaps an extraterrestrial impact. Perhaps a collapse in ocean circulation. Whatever the origin, the effect was profound. A sudden, unyielding winter that forced early human cultures into retreat, extinction, or reinvention. Antarctica's ice layers from this period show abrupt shifts in gas composition, dust accumulation, and temperature markers, changes so rapid that they strain the conventional narrative of slow climatic evolution. If such a collapse could occur once, could it have occurred others? Could it have struck earlier cultures whose traces now lie beneath oceans or ice sheets? The Earth does not preserve every story. Many vanish into the same silence that blankets the continent at the bottom of the world. Another reset occurred around 8,200 years ago. A sudden cooling event recorded in Greenland and Antarctic ice cores alike. Its cause remains uncertain. Some attribute it to a massive glacial outburst flood. Others see it as part of a larger oscillation, a kind of climatic exhale after the immense meltwater pulses that ended the last ice age. Whatever its origin, it reshaped coastlines and forced early civilizations to adapt quickly. The archaeological record reflects widespread shifts in settlement patterns during this time. Cities abandoned, migration routes altered, cultural practices abruptly transformed. Far more dramatic was the 5.9 kiloyear event, a rapid aridification that swept through the ancient world around 3900 BCE. It contributed to the collapse of prehistoric cultures across the Near East and North Africa, reshaping early human migration and paving the way for the rise of later civilizations. In Antarctica's ice, the event appears as another thin mark, dustier, colder, with chemical signatures suggesting global atmospheric change. And then there's the most enigmatic collapse of all, the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, a period when advanced civilizations across the Mediterranean fell within decades. Mycenae, Ugarit, the Hittite Empire. Societies that had achieved remarkable complexity suddenly fractured. Scholars debate the cause: drought, migration, war, systemic failure. But the speed remains staggering. And once again, far from the Mediterranean, Antarctica quietly recorded atmospheric disruptions during the same window. A faint echo of a global disturbance. None of these events proves anything about Antarctica itself. But together, they reveal a pattern. The world resets more often than we admit. Nature erases, Civilizations rise and fall. Knowledge accumulates, then dissolves. Libraries burn. Coastlines drown. Ice advances. And beneath that ice, beneath Antarctica, lie the remnants of climates and ecosystems from before these collapses, preserved like a time capsule buried by the planet itself. If warm periods briefly expose the land, if coastlines emerge for centuries or millennia, then it is not unthinkable that humans, or pre-human ancestors, or maritime cultures now forgotten, encountered this southern frontier in one of those interludes before it vanished again. But when the world collapsed, when ice returned, whatever they left behind would have been buried under a weight beyond reclamation. Geologists studying ice sheet dynamics have discovered something deeply unsettling. The Antarctic ice sheet can collapse far faster than once believed. In 2019, core samples from the Thwaites Glacier region revealed evidence of periods where ice retreated dozens of miles in mere decades. A blink in geological time. If such retreats occurred in the ancient past, and if the ice surged forward just as quickly, entire regions could have been uncovered and buried within the span of a few generations. A coastline might have existed long enough for someone to map it, explore it, or pass its memory onward, only to disappear again, leaving no trace accessible today. This is the pattern that haunts scholars. The idea that the Earth, through its cycles of collapse, has erased not only landscapes, but histories. That the story of humanity might be far older, far more complex, far more fractured than the official narrative allows. Every collapse is a veil drawn over what came before. Every refreeze is a tomb. The question, then, is not whether civilizations once lived in Antarctica. There is no evidence to suggest that. The deeper question is whether civilizations elsewhere once understood far more of the world than we do today, only for that knowledge to be swept away by the same collapses that shaped the geological record. And if that knowledge included a southern land now hidden beneath ice, then the silence surrounding Antarctica becomes part of a much larger silence, one that spans continents, epochs, and the fragile continuity of human memory. In this quiet, unsettling possibility lies the heart of the mystery. The recognition that collapse does not only destroy, it obscures, it rearranges the record. It turns histories into scattered fragments, leaving later ages to piece together what remains from fossils, myths, artifacts, and ice. If the Earth has done this before, if it has erased entire chapters of its story in abrupt geological moments, then what else might lie beneath Antarctica's frozen horizon, waiting in the dark for the next collapse to reveal it? And how many times has the world begun again, its previous memory locked beneath ice until the next cycle sweeps it away once more? There is a kind of hush that settles after considering the world's cycles of collapse, a hush that feels less like silence and more like a held breath. Because once the mind accepts that Earth's past is punctuated by sudden resets, by erasures so large that whole landscapes vanish without leaving a trace, a deeper question begins to sharpen at the edges. What happens to life caught beneath those collapses? What happens to ecosystems sealed away not by extinction, but by ice? And what memories, biological, chemical, genetic, survive in places no sunlight has touched for millions of years? If Antarctica is a vault of forgotten climates, then its subglacial lakes are the sealed chambers within that vault. Dark, pressurized worlds untouched by wind or sky since long before humans existed. Of these lakes, the most mysterious is Lake Vostok, a body of water larger than some of Europe's inland seas, hidden beneath nearly 4 kilometers of ice. It is a place so isolated that whatever lives, or lived, there has evolved in complete darkness, in an environment unlike any other on Earth. When scientists first drilled into the ice above Vostok in the 1990s, the initial samples shocked everyone. Within the frozen sheath surrounding the lake, researchers found traces of microbial DNA, organisms unlike anything known on the surface. Some argued contamination. Others insisted on strict sterilization protocols. Yet the diversity of genetic fragments persisted. Some sequences resembled extremophiles known from deep-sea vents. Others had no clear relatives at all. They hinted at lineages that diverged long before modern ecosystems took shape. Lineages that may have survived a freeze that destroyed everything above. The lake itself was initially thought to be sterile, but further studies suggested otherwise. Chemical gradients, nutrient traces, and unusual gas compositions implied active biology within the ultra-pressurized water. And if life can persist in such conditions, complete darkness, crushing pressure, sub-zero temperatures moderated by geothermal heat, then what does that say about the history of life before the freeze? Did these organisms descend from ecosystems that once thrived in open water, beneath a warmer Antarctic sun? Or did they represent something older, deeper, a memory of Earth's primordial oceans preserved by the ice like a fossil beyond time? Lake Vostok is not the only sealed world beneath the continent. Radar surveys have identified over 400 subglacial lakes scattered across Antarctica's interior, each connected by hidden channels carved by heat rising from below. These lakes form a secret freshwater network flowing beneath the ice like an underground circulatory system. Some lakes fill and drain in cycles, shifting the ice above them. Others remain stable, untouched reservoirs of ancient water. If each lake contains unique ecosystems, then Antarctica may harbor hundreds of isolated biological timelines, parallel worlds evolving in silence. The implications are unsettling. If life survived beneath the ice for millions of years, then life may have existed above the ice far more recently than geological models suggest. And if ancient ecosystems lingered in pockets as the ice advanced, could they not also have existed openly during brief warm windows? Windows long enough for exploration, mapping, or habitation. Yet the biological anomalies do not end with lakes. In 2013, researchers drilling into the ice near Lake Willans discovered active microbial communities thriving in sediments buried under 800 meters of ice. These microbes fed on minerals, gases, and chemical reactions rather than sunlight. They were metabolically alive, reproducing slowly, responding to environmental changes. Their existence challenged the assumption that deep ice is inert. Instead, it appears to host dynamic biological processes. Small, quiet, but persistent. One might argue that these microbes have no connection to human history, and perhaps they do not. But what they represent is something more profound: the continuity of life beneath silence, a reminder that ecosystems can survive collapses that erase entire worlds, a reminder that memory, biological memory, can outlive every reset. Beyond biology, Antarctica's ice holds atmospheric memories as well. Some layers contain rare isotopes created by ancient cosmic events, supernovae, solar storms, gamma-ray bursts, chemical traces that match anomalies found in tree rings or cave formations elsewhere on Earth. These signals offer snapshots of the skies above vanished civilizations, sky events that may have shaped ancient myths, disrupted climates, or triggered migrations. The ice remembers them when no culture does. In some layers, scientists found soot patterns suggesting global wildfires, perhaps caused by volcanic winters or sudden warming pulses. In others, they found traces of metals associated with meteoritic dust, hinting at impact events whose details remain uncertain. The ice acts as a recorder, transcribing the planet's shocks with more fidelity than any human archive. But its recordings are incomplete, interrupted by distortion, erosion, and displacement, as if even the planet's memory cannot fully withstand the violence of its own resets. This fractured memory becomes even more troubling when considering the blue ice fields, areas where ancient ice rises to the surface through wind erosion and glacial flow. Some ice fragments exposed in these regions date back more than 1,000,000 years, far older than the snow that covers them. They contain atmospheric samples from eras otherwise inaccessible. They contain chemical signals out of sequence, as though pieces of different epochs were shuffled together. Scientists attribute this to ice dynamics, but the metaphor is hard to ignore. Antarctica's memory is like a fragmented dream, resurfacing in the wrong order, revealing pieces of stories without context. Even more puzzling are the meteorite concentrations found in these blue ice zones. Antarctica collects cosmic debris more efficiently than any other place on Earth, its cold surface preserving stones from the beginning of the solar system. Some meteorites found here contain amino acids, organic compounds, or isotopic ratios suggesting they formed near stars now long gone. These ancient stones rest beside ice layers that record Earth's last major collapses. A juxtaposition of cosmic and terrestrial memory so strange that one almost senses the continent itself as an archive, not of human history, but of something larger, something spanning eras beyond human comprehension. Yet for all this memory, all this preservation, there remains a glaring absence, the lack of any sign of human presence older than a few centuries. And perhaps this absence is the clearest reminder of all. Not that humans were never there, but that the continent has been buried and unburied too many times for fragile things to survive. Wood decays, stone fractures, bone dissolves. And when a continent is sealed under ice and crushed by millions of tons of pressure, even the strongest traces vanish. This erasure extends beyond physical remains. Knowledge itself is fragile. Maps, stories, navigational traditions, these vanish even faster than artifacts. They dissolve in the flow of wars, migrations, floods, cultural collapses. If any early civilization or maritime culture once glimpsed Antarctica during a warm interval, the memory could easily have been carried forward only as myth, symbol, or fragment, until finally, even those faded. The ice remembers. But memory is not the same as proof, and the silence beneath Antarctica is wide enough for many possibilities, which leads to the most haunting question of all. If life has endured beneath Antarctica for millions of years, hidden, sealed, untouched, what other forms of memory might lie beneath that ice, waiting for the next shift of the world to reveal them? And what would we recognize in those memories, if we ever found them? There is a special kind of stillness that comes after contemplating the sealed lakes. A stillness that feels as though one has entered a library where the shelves stretch endlessly into darkness. And in this hush, it becomes clear that the ice itself is not merely a barrier. It is a medium, a recorder, a keeper of the world's forgotten cycles. Because deep within Antarctica's frozen miles are layers of memory so old, so compressed, that reading them is like trying to decipher the breath of a vanished Earth. And yet, even this memory is fragmented. Blue ice rises from the depths and resurfaces in impossible places. Ancient air bubbles appear in layers that should belong to different epochs. And scattered among the drifting shards of deep time are signals, clues that refuse to fit the steady rhythm of climate models. As though Earth's history, like a long-forgotten manuscript, were missing chapters, its lines rearranged by forces we still barely understand. The blue ice fields are the first hint that the record is not linear. In these regions, fierce katabatic winds scour the surface relentlessly, shaving away younger snow and exposing ice from hundreds of thousands of years ago. Some pieces date back nearly 2 million years, far older than the ice cores drilled elsewhere. And yet, this ancient ice lies directly on the surface, as if time itself had migrated upward. Scientists explain the phenomenon as vertical flow within the glacier, ice rising and tilting as it moves. But the effect is unnerving, fragments of different eras sitting side by side, like pages from separate books shuffled together by a careless hand. This shuffling makes certain events stand out. Abrupt warming spikes appear in layers that should reflect colder climates. Methane surges emerge in periods previously thought stable. Dust patterns, normally associated with arid continents, appear in Antarctic ice from epochs when those regions should have been wet. It is as though the climate did not always move with the slow deliberateness assumed by models, but sometimes lurched violently, compressing centuries of change into mere decades. One of the greatest clues lies in the isotopic composition of the ancient air bubbles, tiny pockets of atmosphere trapped when snow fell millions of years ago. These bubbles capture the breath of forests that no longer exist, volcanoes long extinct, oceans that have shifted their currents. But in some layers, the isotopic ratios are disturbingly inconsistent with global patterns. They suggest rapid reorganizations of atmospheric circulation, shifts in wind patterns, or sudden releases of greenhouse gases from unknown sources. A few researchers have quietly pointed out that such anomalies resemble the signatures expected from massive ice sheet collapses, events that could rapidly alter the planet's balance. And if Antarctica's ice has collapsed before, perhaps multiple times, then its current frozen form may not represent a stable ancient state, but the latest iteration in a long cycle of burial and exposure. The meteorites found in Antarctica add another dimension to this fractured timeline. The continent is the world's greatest collector of cosmic debris. The cold preserves stones that elsewhere would erode. Some meteorites date back to the birth of the solar system. Others carry organic molecules, amino acids, or isotopic fingerprints, suggesting origins near supernova remnants. These meteorites lie scattered on the surface, concentrated in the blue ice fields, coexisting with ice that formed long after they fell. A juxtaposition of cosmic and terrestrial time that makes the continent feel less like a place and more like an observatory, recording not only Earth's history, but the wider universes as well. Among the most remarkable finds are micrometeorites embedded far beneath the ice. Tiny metallic grains from space locked in layers millions of years old. These grains record supernova dust, solar storms, and cosmic rays with an intimacy no telescope can match. Some layers show spikes in extraterrestrial particles, corresponding with periods of global stress. Others show declines, suggesting quieter cosmic eras. But even these cosmic records contain mysteries. One layer contains anomalously high levels of iron-60, a radioactive isotope forged in massive stars. Its presence implies that Earth once drifted through the remnants of a nearby supernova, an event that must have affected life, climate, and atmospheric chemistry. Yet no clear extinction event is associated with this layer. The Earth absorbed the shock silently. It's only witnessed the ice. The ice also records volcanic events with striking clarity. Thin lines of sulfate and ash mark eruptions both local and global. The Toba supervolcano, Tambora. Unknown eruptions whose signatures are strong, but whose locations remain unidentified. Some layers show spikes from eruptions so large that they may have induced temporary climatic winters. Others show trace metals associated with deep mantle activity, hinting at volcanic events in Antarctica itself. Events now buried beneath ice so thick that no direct geological evidence remains. But perhaps the most disturbing signals of all are the mysterious nitrate spikes found in certain layers. These spikes have been linked to extreme solar storms, coronal mass ejections capable of disrupting the planet's magnetic field and damaging the upper atmosphere. Some storms were far stronger than anything recorded in modern times. One was nearly twice as powerful as the Carrington event of 1859. If such a storm struck today, it would devastate global infrastructure. If it struck ancient civilizations, its effects may have been interpreted as omens, disasters, or divine wrath. But the ice remembers the event with indifference. A thin, chemically unusual line, marking a moment when the skies flared in ways nearly forgotten. All these signals, cosmic, volcanic, atmospheric, climatic, form a mosaic of memory. But a mosaic with missing tiles, broken edges, and rearranged patterns. Scientists analyzing the deepest cores frequently encounter noise, anomalies that do not fit models, cycles that break rhythm, layers that seem out of sequence. They attribute this to ice flow, mixing, compaction, and often they are correct. But the larger truth is more unsettling. Antarctica's ice preserves the past imperfectly, erratically, like a mind protecting itself from trauma by scrambling the order of events. If the ice is a witness, it is a witness with scars. If the ice is a record, it is a record written during earthquakes. And perhaps this is why it feels incomplete. Not because it refuses to tell the story, but because the story itself was shattered before the ice ever formed. Catastrophes tore through the world. Climates shifted abruptly. Continents moved. Oceans surged. Civilizations, if any existed, fell long before the ice could bury their traces. What remains is only what survived the shattering. A fragment of air, a shred of pollen, a flicker of cosmic dust, a broken sequence of temperature swings, clues without context, pages without a book, memories without a narrator. And in this broken record lies a deeper question, one that pushes quietly against the edge of thought. If Antarctica holds the most ancient atmospheric files on Earth, if it archives the planet's greatest collapses, if it preserves cosmic interactions and biological remnants from worlds long past, then what is missing? What vanished so completely that not even the ice could preserve it? What story was erased so thoroughly that only its silence remains? There is a different kind of silence that enters the mind now. A silence not geological, not cosmic, not carved by extinction or ice, but human. A silence made of absence, omission, unfinished sentences. Because after wandering through ancient climates, collapsed worlds, and fractured memories buried in frozen layers, the story begins to drift toward the present, toward the people who went south carrying instruments, maps, research grants, and who returned with only fragments of what they witnessed. Antarctica's physical mysteries can be explained, debated, or at least placed within scientific frameworks. But the human layer, the modern layer, is more elusive. It is a story built not from fossils or ice cores, but from the strange quiet that surrounds the continent today. A quiet maintained by treaties, logistics, restricted zones, halted projects, and moments where the world looked south, not with curiosity, but with caution. One begins to sense this quiet not by examining what is said about Antarctica, but by noticing what is not. For a continent that is supposedly barren, empty and harmless, Antarctica is subject to a surprising number of limits. Certain valleys, particularly those whose geology exposes deep bedrock, require special permits to enter. Flight routes are controlled. Satellite imaging, though widespread, has gaps. not only due to technical limitations, but also due to the unusual orbital restrictions placed around the pole. Research stations are placed with an almost deliberate geometry, clustering around zones of known magnetic or geothermal interest. Nothing overtly secret, nothing stated, only a pattern of decisions that doesn't quite match the narrative of a land valued only for science. The Antarctic Treaty is often held up as a triumph of cooperation, a rare moment when nations agreed to protect a continent for peaceful purposes. And perhaps it is, yet the speed with which it was signed and the intensity with which it has been maintained raise quiet questions. Why did rival powers, locked in the Cold War, suddenly agree that no one should control Antarctica? Why did they cement restrictions so absolute that they remain unchanged more than 60 years later? Some say the treaty was designed to prevent militarization. Others argue it was meant to avoid conflicts over resources. But there is another interpretation, never stated, never official, that lingers beneath the surface, that the continent held, or was suspected of holding, something worth controlling access to. Not gold, not oil, not minerals. Something else. Something harder to define. Evidence of this unease appears in the record of research projects that started with great enthusiasm and then quietly stopped. Drilling operations that ran out of funding unexpectedly. Expeditions curtailed early due to logistical concerns. Areas mapped once, then never again. A handful of scientific teams have reported equipment failure localized to specific regions where instruments behaved erratically even in stable weather. Some fields of research, deep drilling, high-resolution gravimetry, subglacial mapping, advance extremely slowly in Antarctica compared to other parts of the world. Not because the science is impossible, but because permissions are scarce, logistics are limited, or projects are redirected without clear explanation. None of this forms a conspiracy. Instead, it forms a pattern of hesitation, as though the closer research comes to answering certain questions, the more fragile its funding becomes, as though the world has agreed, silently, to explore Antarctica only up to a point. Even the stories told by scientists themselves carry traces of this hesitation. Researchers stationed at remote outposts sometimes describe sounds under the ice. Reverberations, booms, pressure shifts, so powerful they shake the ground. These noises are attributed to ice movement, glacial calving, or thermal expansion, and often they are. But the descriptions vary in unsettling ways. Some speak of rhythmic pulses. Others describe tones with patterns too structured to be random. Nothing supernatural, only strange. Strange enough to unsettle those who spend months in isolation, listening to the continent breathe. There are also accounts of strange radar returns, shadows beneath the ice, shapes that resemble caverns, voids, or unexpected density contrasts. Most of these anomalies are eventually explained. Some are not. A few radar images captured in the 1990s, particularly in East Antarctica, revealed geometries so unusual that research teams repeated the scans only to produce inconclusive results. The findings were never widely published, not suppressed, simply set aside, overshadowed by more conventional studies. And then there are the zones no one visits. Not because they are dangerous, not because they are protected ecologically, but because they are simply not part of the program. Too remote, too logistically challenging, too costly to explore. Zones where airborne surveys are rare, where ground expeditions are virtually non-existent. Zones that lie directly above magnetic anomalies, geothermal hotspots, or deep basins whose shape suggests an ancient fracture in the crust. It is easy to dismiss this as practical. Antarctica is enormous, hostile, and expensive to study. But the pattern persists. The most unusual regions receive the least direct attention. Modern footage from Antarctica is abundant. Penguins, ice shelves, research stations, supply flights. But footage from the deep interior, far from human outposts, is scarce. Largely confined to satellite images and a handful of expeditions decades old. Even high-resolution commercial satellite maps blur or soften certain areas. Not deliberately, not suspiciously, but consistently. As though the pole itself resists clear vision, the silence spreads beyond physical access. When researchers publish papers on anomalies, magnetic inconsistencies, unusual heat sources, unexpected isotopes, the tone is often cautious. Conclusions carefully qualified, implications minimized, a sense that the continent's mysteries should be acknowledged, but not emphasized. Even the narratives shared publicly follow a familiar script. Antarctica is cold, empty, studied, understood. The anomalies are natural. The secrets are scientific. The land is blank, quiet, passive. Yet beneath this script is the unmistakable tension between what is known and what is known too incompletely to discuss. In a sense, this tension mirrors the ice itself, a thin, immaculate surface above a hidden world. A world that reveals itself only reluctantly, only in fragments. And perhaps the modern silence is not an effort to hide anything, but a recognition of how little can truly be understood. Antarctica is a continent that resists interpretation. It is too large, too complex, too fractured by deep time. The more humanity tries to study it, the more it reveals its own limits. Still, there are moments, scattered across decades of expeditions, when individuals return from the ice carrying a different impression, not of a blank landscape, but of a presence. Not a being or intention, but a weight, a sense that the continent itself holds something unspoken. Geologists speak of it, glaciologists sense it, even pilots describe it in their own way. The feeling of flying over a land that does not want to be fully seen, a land whose surface hides not emptiness, but an overwhelming density of time. That is perhaps Antarctica's greatest secret. That it is not merely remote, it is concentrated. A continent made of memory and erasure woven together, where present time feels thin, fragile, stretched across something deeper. And if modern research approaches the edge of that depth only to hesitate, then one must ask quietly, is the silence around Antarctica shaped by what we do not know, or by what we suspect, but cannot yet allow ourselves to articulate? What exactly lies on the far side of that hesitation? There is a certain feeling that comes only at the end of a long journey through silence, a feeling not of conclusion, but of standing at the edge of something too large, too deep, too ancient to grasp. It is the sensation of looking across a horizon that does not end, a horizon that seems to fold back into itself, hiding whatever truth waits beyond. And as the mind turns back to Antarctica, after wandering through buried forests, forgotten coastlines, fractured climates, and the quiet hesitations of modern science, the continent no longer feels like a place. It feels like a threshold between what the Earth remembers and what it forgets, between what humans can know and what slips beyond the reach of memory, between the world that exists above the ice and the other world that sleeps below, sealed in time. Standing on that threshold, at least in imagination, one begins to sense the continent differently, not as a blankness, not as a void, but as a presence shaped by time rather than by life. A presence that has witnessed the planet remake itself again and again, while holding on to fragments too fragile to survive anywhere else. Antarctica becomes something like a mirror, reflecting not what we see, but what has been lost. And perhaps that is why it calls to people in a way few places do. Not with promises, but with mysteries old enough to feel like echoes of something forgotten long before humanity began to write. In the quiet between breaths, the mind drifts back to the buried mountains, the sharp peaks of the Gamburtsev Range, hidden beneath ice as though pushed into the underworld by the weight of millennia. One imagines them standing in open air, once, long before the freeze, piercing the sky of a world that no longer exists. Rivers spilling down their slopes, trees clinging to their ridges, creatures moving through a landscape now erased. And if such a world lived even briefly, what memories might have passed through it? What wanderers, what animals, what early beings felt the winds in that valley? Then the mind drifts to the coastlines traced beneath the ice, faint as ghosts, shorelines recorded on maps centuries before explorers claimed discovery. Were those coastlines the remnants of worlds uncovered by ancient warmth? Or were they preserved memories carried across civilizations long gone? The thought lingers, not as certainty, but as a fragile possibility suspended in the stillness. And beneath these images lies another, the sealed lakes, each a small universe unto itself. Layers of water older than language, older than civilization, older than the ice above them. Life moving in slow cycles through darkness deeper than any human has experienced. These creatures, microscopic and ancient, are not evidence of anything beyond themselves. Yet their survival hints at something profound. The idea that life persists even as worlds collapse. That existence continues beneath silence. That memory does not always vanish. Sometimes it simply retreats into depths where no sunlight reaches. Perhaps that is what Antarctica represents most clearly, the persistence of what the world tries to erase. Not only fossils or microbes or chemical traces, but the idea that time is not a smooth narrative. Time stutters. Time folds. Time forgets and remembers in ways no timeline can capture. The ice, for all its stillness, is shaped by forces that bend the past into strange contours. Events that should be clear become distorted. Signals that should align drift. The continent becomes a library that rearranges its books as it sleeps. And so humanity approaches it with caution. With science, yes. With curiosity, always. But also with a quiet reluctance, as though sensing that some truths are easier to accept in fragments than in full. It is one thing to study the ice. It is another to accept what the ice implies. That the world beneath our feet is far older, far more violent, and far more prone to forgetting than our stories allow. In this final wandering thought, the mind drifts toward the old explorers, their journals half filled with observations and half filled with silence. Shackleton hearing sounds under the ice, Scott writing of shapes in the storm, Bird hinting at distortions he could not explain. Their words feel like soft footprints, soon lost to the wind, yet carrying hints of a continent that revealed itself only in glimmers. Not a revelation, but an impression. A presence felt at the edge of vision. And perhaps that is all Antarctica allows. A glimpse, never a view. A whisper, never a message. A suggestion, never an answer. Even today, the silence persists. Not because something is being hidden, but because some things cannot be spoken clearly. The continent defies explanation not through secrecy, but through scale. It compresses time. It buries epochs. It distorts the magnetic fabric of the earth. It keeps life alive in places that should be sterile. It remembers events the rest of the world has forgotten. And in this way, it becomes something like a guardian of the planet's most ancient wounds. The thought grows softer now, settling into something almost philosophical. If Antarctica has frozen, thawed, collapsed, risen, shattered, and reformed across millions of years, if it has watched continents drift, climates flip, species vanish, then what does it see when it looks at us? Humanity has existed for only a flicker of time compared to the long breath of ice. Our histories are young, our memories brief, our civilizations fragile enough to be undone by forces Antarctica has survived countless times. And yet we persist in asking questions, in trying to trace the shapes beneath the ice, in trying to read the fractured script of the ice cores. Perhaps this desire to understand is itself part of the mystery, an instinct older than any culture, urging us to look into the darkness not for knowledge, but for recognition. As though some part of us senses that the missing chapters beneath Antarctica are not separate from our own story, but entangled with it. The continent remains silent, but its silence is not empty. It is full, dense with the weight of everything it remembers and everything it has buried. A silence thicker than ice, a silence older than forests, a silence shaped by eruptions, storms, magnetic shifts, and oceans long gone. And standing at the edge of that silence, one cannot help but wonder, what if the story of Antarctica is not about what lies beneath the ice, but about what the ice has erased? What worlds rose and fell before the freeze? What knowledge flickered and vanished in a single climatic breath? What memories escaped collapse only to be sealed away in a continent no one would see again for tens of thousands of years? In the end, the most haunting thought is also the simplest. If Antarctica holds the oldest silence on Earth, then perhaps it also holds the oldest question. A question not about what happened there, but about what was lost. And as long as that question remains unanswered, the continent will continue to wait, an unmoving horizon, holding its secrets beneath a weight of ice and time so deep that only the Earth itself can remember. What then is Antarctica really? A frozen desert, a geological archive, a vault of forgotten climates? Or is it something stranger? The memory of a world that came before ours, waiting patiently beneath the cold for someone, someday, to finally hear what it has been trying to say.